So welcome everyone to this Morpheus Tech Brief on custom reports. I am Martez Reed. This one will be definitely an interesting one, as we'll walk through the concepts and the constructs as it relates to custom reports within the Morpheus platform. And then we'll actually delve into a little bit of live coding as I walk through the process of actually developing a custom report semi on the fly. And we'll see how that goes to hopefully give you the experience of walking through the end-to-end process of development of a custom report plugin within the Morpheus platform. Certainly feel free to post any questions as we go along in the Q&A section, and I'll get to those as we go through. So without further ado, let's delve into the topic. So Morpheus Tech Brief on custom reports. Before we get too far, let's take a just quick overview look at the Morpheus platform. So the Morpheus platform is traditionally classified as a cloud management platform. So a number of the areas that Morpheus focuses in from a core value proposition standpoint are workload lifecycle management. So being able to facilitate the automated end-to-end provisioning of workloads. That includes integration with automation tools and capabilities to be able to provision production workloads in a matter of minutes as opposed to hours or days. Or potentially weeks, given certain environments. Day two operations to be able to manage that workload that has been provisioned in a self-service fashion within the Morpheus platform. So being able to run things like Ansible playbooks against the workloads or PowerShell scripts or interact interface with the workload to reconfigure various different capabilities from a day two management perspective. And then finally, the decommissioning phase. So after a workload is no longer needed, the Morpheus platform can be utilized to essentially undo what it did during the actual provisioning process. So things like integration with IP address management, DNS, Cmdb, to ensure that those things that are properly updated or those things that need to be deleted or destroyed are deleted and destroyed. Second component is automation and orchestration within the Morpheus platform. So being able to leverage the Morpheus platform as a centralized platform for the execution of automation. So things like Ansible playbooks, PowerShell scripts, Bash scripts, HTTP tasks to interact and interface with the IT environment to be able to provide things like management, also some of the more complex automation and orchestration that's necessary for things like provisioning or just what we term as operational workflows. So things like creation of Active Directory users or various tasks within an enterprise environment that it would be helpful to automate those processes. And then finally, costing and analytics is a big capability of the platform to be able to provide insight and visibility. So things like showback, which ultimately lends itself to chargeback in various organizations. All right, so now that we know a little bit about Morpheus platform, let's continue on to the custom reports. And so custom reports within the Morpheus platform is a plugin. And so the Morpheus platform has a plugin architecture that allows the platform to be extended to serve new use cases that are often business specific. So a given customer, a given partner has a use case very specific to their organization or a customer that they are working with. And so there's a desire to be able to extend the platform to meet a specific use case. So the platform includes various plugin types. So custom reports being one of them. UI tabs is another one. So instance, as well as server tabs can be customized from the platform perspective. Custom service catalog layout, custom tasks, custom approvals, custom Cipher. There are various plugins that are available from the plugin architecture standpoint within the Morpheus platform to augment the capabilities of the platform in terms of out-of-the-box capabilities. And so let's take a quick look at the composition or the makeup of a plugin from the Morpheus perspective. So the Morpheus plugins are compiled jar files. So the plugins are written in Java or Groovy. And so from an architecture or structure standpoint, one of the things to denote is that the plugin can have multiple providers. And so what that means is that a plugin can utilize various different types of providers within a single plugin or multiple instances of a single provider. And so as an example, what we have here is a plugin. Our example plugin has a report provider as well as a UI tab provider. And so within that single plugin, there are multiple providers or potentially multiple use cases that could be served. So as a more realistic example might be, let's say, an AWS plugin that facilitates integration with various different aspects of AWS. It might include multiple report providers for various different reports that are included in the plugin. It could include a UI tab or several UI tab providers as well, in addition to the various other plugin type capabilities that the Morpheus Platform plugin architecture provides, can be encapsulated within a single plugin. So additional information about plugins can be found utilizing some of these resources that we've listed here. So there is a plugin development landing page, developer.morpheusdata.com is a great source for additional information about plugins. In the landing page for the developers, plugin development is several links that some of them are shown here to a Git repo with various samples, as well as the actual core library API code, as well as plugin docs, which are a set of documents or documentation that goes into a greater detail about utilizing and developing plugins. And then finally, the plugin API docs for insight into the actual API that can be interfaced with from a plugin perspective. All right, so let's keep moving. So custom reports, that's what we're here for. That's what we're concerned about. Out of the box, the Morpheus platform includes 30+ custom reports to get visibility into various aspects of the platform and its integrations. Custom reports can take on a number of different forms. So things like by default being able to query the Morpheus database to pull data out of the database for visualization and reports. The plugin capability also supports the ability to reference an external API endpoint, or as an example, potentially also utilizing an SDK for a cloud provider or an external platform to be able to fetch or query data from there. One of the things I often talk about with that is the ability to be able to aggregate or correlate data from external sources to information that is being pulled from the Morpheus database. So as an example, having a custom report that pulls data as relates to instances from the Morpheus database, and then reaching out to external systems or an external system and correlating the data with that particular instance that's pulled back from the Morpheus platform and enriching the information that's shown in the report is an example. So custom report architecture looks like this. So custom reports are generated utilizing HTML, could be CSS, custom CSS, as well as custom JavaScript as part of the generation of the report. And so what happens in most of the standard cases, and the example that we'll walk through, is the Groovy code is developed to query the Morpheus database to pull out the data that's desired from the database, and then ultimately render that data utilizing a template that represents or is shown as an HTML report that it could include, as I mentioned, custom JavaScript as well as custom CSS to fancy up the report or to make it a little more visually appealing or a little more robust in terms of the experience that the user sees from the report. So now that we know the general architecture of how reports are generated, let's take a look at some examples. So some examples that I've created, as an example, is a custom Cipher summary report. Nothing super extravagant, but really shows the ability to be able to reach into the database, pull out data. In this particular example, it is information about Cipher items within the database. And so what I've done is I've effectively reached into the database, grabbed the list of Cipher items, and then what we see here from the overview standpoint is the count of items. So in this particular example, we see 39 items, 9 of them are passwords, 4 of them are TF-bars, 23 are secrets, so on and so forth. And essentially what's being done is that data is being generated as it iterates through each of the rows pulled back from the database query. Various things can be done to manipulate the data and interact and interface with the data. So another example, this one is a custom report utilizing the JavaScript capabilities that is available from the plugin perspective. And so what's been done is I've added a JavaScript library, Google Charts, to be able to visualize, in this particular example, the automation task that have ran over the last 90 days in this particular Morpheus instance. So a number of possibilities to visualize the data, either from Morpheus or external to Morpheus, utilizing the capabilities that the plugin presents. All right, so now let's delve into the development of custom reports. In this particular example, the custom report that we're going to walk through is a pretty basic one, but really the goal is to look at the end-to-end process of development of a custom report and some of the more complex or more advanced concepts in greater detail. And then that provides the springboard to develop some more of the more visually appealing and more visually custom reports with it utilizing the Morpheus custom report capability. So in addition to that, what else we're also going to do is create a drop down as we present it to when we want to run the report. On this particular case, we're utilizing AWS EBS volumes that have been discovered by the Morpheus platform. And we want to be able to view the, in this particular case, toggle on the attachment status. So in this particular example, it's either all, attached, or unattached is what we want to see when the report is generated. So let's take a look at some of the requirements for developing custom report plugins. Java 8, or from a Java perspective, Gradle is used to build the plugin from a build standpoint. So certainly so Maven could also be used as well, but the examples reference Gradle. So it's likely going to be easier to utilize Gradle for the build of the plugin. Number of optional requirements that I find helpful when I develop custom reports. MySQL Workbench. So the data, as I mentioned, typically resides in the Morpheus database unless there's a desire for external data to be queried or accessed. And so MySQL Bench or various other SQL clients, I know for myself, provides a simpler visual interaction with the database to be able to see what items are in the tables within the Morpheus database. Docker, as well as Visual Studio Code, are two things that I use. I'm using a MacBook. And so I use that as my development environment for building the actual plugin itself, as opposed to installing Java and Gradle on my local laptop. I utilize Visual Studio remote containers to facilitate that process. Certainly doesn't have to be something that is used, just something that I find convenient to avoid the installation of those dependencies or requirements on my laptop. Knowledge areas that are helpful. So some of the things we've mentioned, SQL is one of them. We're going to be working with the database, and so performing SQL queries. So it's helpful to just have some high level knowledge of SQL and some of the syntax for generating or creating those statements. Handlebars Templating engine. So as I mentioned, the HTML rendering. So what's being utilized is Handlebars to render that particular template. We'll take a look at some of what that syntax looks like. Looks very similar to various other templating engines or languages, however you want to refer to them as. HTML, CSS, JavaScript are helpful. And then finally, Java and Groovy is certainly helpful in terms of development of the plugins. But really the goal is to ensure that we've got an end-to-end experience for development of the plugins. So we'll walk through that in pretty good detail. As I said, feel free to post any questions as we go along of something that may not be understandable or doesn't necessarily make sense, and we'll try to get to it. All right, and so let's walk through at a high level the development steps, and then we'll start going through these. See how quickly we can go through the steps to develop these. So first thing, identifying the desired data from the Morpheus database. So we've taken a look at what we want our custom report to be. In our particular example, we're going to develop a report that provides us data or insight into AWS EBS volumes that are in the Morpheus database. So that's the data that we want. The thing that we're going to have to do is investigate or find out where that particular table lies and see what data is there, see if we need to enrich that data utilizing another table in the Morpheus database. Once we found the data, and as I mentioned, there may be data in other tables that we may need to aggregate and pull together. So we need to develop our SQL query to fetch the data. So in examples where an external API endpoint is used, this may not apply, but certainly helpful to know. At that point, we're going to start creating our plugin directory structure. So start fleshing out what the file structure looks like for our plugin. We're going to add our Gradle build file to actually start building our plugin. Add the plugin class, so instantiation of the plugin, Handlebars template file, custom report provider class, option source provider class. Those all need to be added. We'll walk through those. Compilation or compiling of the custom report plugin, installing the custom report plugin, and then finally generation of a custom report. So what we're going to do now is we're going to delve into the actual building of the custom report. So I'm going to go several different tools, command line, some MySQL Workbench, some Visual Studio Code, and we'll see how to actually start building the plugin from scratch or semi-scratch. I've already got an example built out that I will be referencing, but we'll see the process of building that out. All right, so as I mentioned, the first thing I need to do is I need to look at the tables in the database. So we got a couple of things up here. So the first thing I have is I need the password for the Morpheus database. So in this particular case, I'm just going to use the root password for my Morpheus database to access it. So I will be using, as I mentioned, SQL Workbench. And so the file that contains the information for accessing the database is in etc morpheus-secrets.json on my Morpheus instance. So I've SSH into my Morpheus instance. In this case, it's an all-in-one deployment. And I've grabbed the root password for my SQL database instance. So what I want to do is I've already created the connection. So in the particular case of my SQL Workbench, what I've done is I've created an SSH connection. So what my SQL Workbench will do is it'll SSH to the instance. And then once it SSHs and connects to the instance, it will then connect to the database. In this particular case, I believe that the database is by default not listening for external connections. And so that's what requires or facilitates the need to SSH into the box. Certainly it can be changed, but in this case, I've kept it as a default. So I'll enter my SSH password, so the password for the instance itself, at which point I'm now prompted for the MySQL database password. And so I'll enter in that password that we got from the instance itself in the Morpheus file. And so in this particular case, I have the Morpheus database, I have the tables. And so what I want to do is there's a number of tables within the Morpheus database. And so that's why I said identify or find the data. And so in my particular case, I've got somewhat of an idea of where the data might live. So in this particular case, we want volumes. So volumes, storage starts to give me an idea of where I might want to look. So certainly a number of the tables are pretty self-explanatory in terms of their purpose. It might take some mapping and correlation to figure out where the data I want actually lives in comparison to some of the names on the tables. All right, so in our particular case, we want storage volume. Storage volume is the data that we want from, or the table that we want. So certainly we see a number of other storage volume like tables, whether it be permission, type, snapshot, so on and so forth. So in our particular case, let's do storage volume. So if we take a look, what I can see here is several columns of data in terms of storage volumes, but I do see things that make me think that this is the right place. So things like device name, volume type. I start to see things like unique ID. I see some ESXi volume references. I see a few other things, but what I really want is I want EBS volumes. I want AWS. I need to find AWS EBS volumes. So I do start to see constructs that sound akin to some things that would be AWS EBS. So things like provisioned and attached. So I want to be able to find attached and unattached EBS volumes. So as I'm looking through, I see external ID as well as name has vol dash and an identifier, unique identifier. So for those familiar with AWS, this is an AWS construct for volume identification. So I know that these are AWS EBS volumes by assumption, but in this particular case, I'm still kind of assuming that. And so one of the things that's commonly referenced from a Morpheus database standpoint is a type. So I need to find what type of storage volumes are these. And so as I'm looking for a column that says type ID. As we scroll, we see type ID. So the three bottom volumes in this particular table have a type ID of 23 and 24. You can also see the status is unattached. So type ID of 23 and 24. So now I'm left to figure out, okay, what actual type of volume are these? So that's where I mentioned there are various other tables within the Morpheus database that include the mapping. And so if I needed to find the type of volume in this particular case, I might want to go to a table that might say something like storage volume type. Might be a good place to go to find the actual mapping of the type IDs that we see in this particular table to the actual names of the volumes that I want. So in this particular case, I'm going to open up that table. I'm going to see 23 and 24 in this particular table. Amazon GP2, Amazon GP3 are the types of volumes within this particular table. And so that lets me know that those are Amazon volumes. The other thing this provides the capability of is a place of reference. So one of the things we mentioned was that we want the EBS volumes. And so there are a number of other volume types within this particular table that I don't want. I don't care about DigitalOcean volume types. I don't care about Huawei. I don't care about OpenEBS. I don't want those. I just want Amazon EBS volumes. So there's a number of Amazon EBS volumes in this particular table that I might want to pull back. And so got a question. Can we consider this database a Cmdb that holds all the CIs for all the clouds? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. And so the idea being, is the Morpheus database going to have all of the information about the resources and the mappings in the particular clouds that it's integrated with? It does contain a large number of the resources that can be found or discovered via those clouds. Certainly, I would not say that it includes all of the resources. So you would have to see if the information that you desire or want is in the Morpheus database. And if it is, you can pull it out from the Morpheus database, even if it's not visualized or seemingly used in places within the platform that it might be. The other aspect or the other way to address that might be an API call. Or in the case of AWS, I might want to utilize the AWS SDK as part of my custom report to potentially enrich the report to pull back data that is not natively included in the Morpheus database. So great question. And so as we're going through, continuing on, we want to scope the query from the SQL standpoint to just include the data from our Amazon EBS volumes. So as part of that process, what I want to do is, that's what I talked about when we need to craft our SQL query. I know what data, or we know what data that we want from the database. We want just the EBS volumes from AWS, but we need to scope our query to just that. And so what we can do is, and that's where I talked about the SQL statements being of particular value, and having at least some knowledge or experience. Certainly there are great resources to Google to find certain aspects of SQL queries that we want. And so that's what I've actually done as part of this process. It was me Googling, finding and crafting the particular SQL statement that I wanted. So I think I might have one of the examples up here. All right, so I actually do. So in the interest of time, I have already gone through the process of pulling back that data from the database that we want. little TV magic. And so one of the things that we want to do is let's take a look at, go back really quickly to our example. So our example report includes ID, name, status, type, and size. So those are particular columns that we want to pull back from our SQL query is ID, name, status, type, and size. They don't necessarily directly map up to the column name. So those are our reference points from a query standpoint. And so as we see with our SQL statement, we have ID, name, type ID, which maps to our type header. Status, max storage is from a Morpheus database standpoint for the storage volume table is our size. And then in this particular case, external ID, which would map to name as well. So name and external ID are the same. I don't have to pull both of them back actually in our SQL query, but I'll leave that there just for the purposes of keeping that statement there. And so where we want to pull it from is our storage volume table. That's what we were looking at. So we see that it's there. So this is where it starts to get a little more complex. And so one of the things we talked about was that we only want the EBS volumes from this particular, from our particular table. And so we have where. So that means what we want to get, or the scenario that we want to pull back the data. Where type ID, so type ID defined the relationship between this table and the volume type table. So type ID, in this particular case, if the type ID of the record or the row is in, and we perform another SQL query. So what we want to do is we want to pull back the IDs from the volume type table for Amazon, anything that's Amazon. So in this particular case, we've got select ID, so pull back the ID from the storage volume table, where the code includes Amazon dash anything. So that's where we saw in our particular scenario, we wanted from the code column, Amazon dash anything. So that includes the IO1, GP2, GP3, so forth and so on. That's what I want to pull back from this particular table. That's the only thing I want to pull back. So that's what our statement is doing. Give me the IDs for all of those records for Amazon, and then use that as our reference point to evaluate which records we want to pull from the storage volume table. And then finally, a couple of other things. So in this particular statement, I'm including and ref type of compute zone. So in this particular example, I do have an instance provisioned via Morpheus that would pull back as it appears from a report standpoint, a duplicate volume. But what's actually happening is that the volume shows as it would from AWS, like the other volumes that are unattached, but it also shows another row that describes essentially the reference point to an instance in Morpheus. So what I'm doing is I'm essentially pulling that out of the data set because I don't want that to show up twice. So just another one of those things as you go through identifying, manipulating the data to address that particular case. And then finally, the status of like unattached in this particular example, I actually have another statement that actually facilitates the option drop down that we have. All right, so now that we know what data we know how to pull back the data. So I'll just run the statement. So I think there's an error in that particular statement, but we'll take a look at what it looks like from a code perspective. So let's keep it moving and keep going through the particular steps that we need to accomplish. So we've identified the data, we've developed the SQL query to fetch the data. So now we need to start creating the plugin directory structure. So one of the things I will do is I will come to Visual Studio Code. You know what, I won't. So I will actually create a directory on my file system that is for our custom plugin, Morpheus TB plugin. All right, and so in this particular case, I'll come into Visual Studio Code and I will open up that directory and we will start creating and crafting our plugin. So add folder to workspace, Morpheus TB plugin, add. So now we have a blank directory structure. So one of the things I mentioned was that I do like to use the Visual Studio Code remote containers to facilitate or do the plugin development. And so I'm going to go through those really quick just to get them out of the way. And so certainly it's something that you can look up if there's greater interest in utilizing remote containers for development of plugins. So I have dev.container, and I need a new file named devcontainer.json. So this is usually my development process in terms of walking through the process of developing a given plugin. And so I will pull in a particular image. And so in this particular case, it is using this specific Docker image. The other thing I need to do is I need to create a workspace within Visual Studio Code. TB plugin.code, I think it's code-workspace. I will fix that if it's incorrect. Just double checking that it is correct. Yes, it is correct. All right, so what I want to do is I want to open the workspace. If it'll open. All right, let's see if I can reopen the container. All right, so I'm going to save my workspace. Code-workspace. All right, so I didn't like that. db-plugin. So I'm going to replace that. I didn't actually put any information in it. All right, so that's what I was looking for. I was looking for the actual folder structure that I didn't put in. All right, so now it's prompting me to reopen in the container. I want to reopen in the container. And so what it's doing is starting a container on my file system to load up the content. And so that way I'll be able to run all my Gradle commands. I'll run whatever commands I want from a Java Groovy Gradle perspective within the container without installing any of those dependencies on my local laptop. So that's why I do that, just for simplification. All right, so I don't want to keep jumping back and forth, but let's go to the steps. So plugin structure, we'll start fleshing some of that, but we'll start with the actual adding of the Gradle build file. So in the case of Gradle build system, so build.gradle is what I want. So one of the things I do want to reference is developer.morpheusdata.com. So if I go to plugin docs, there's a number of really great pieces of information here. And so I see an example for a build.gradle file that includes the information I need to actually build the plugin. So in this example, I'll grab one that's very similar to this one that I already have on my system. I will walk through the main components that are very much similar to this. So build.gradle. And so a number of the things that we see, I'll go ahead and save that. Plugin pieces at the top, apply plugin. These are very standard things from a plugin perspective. So typically those are just copy and paste. The major items of note would be group version as we get to here. So in this particular case, we have com.morpheusdata.com. So typically the reverse DNS name for your organization or whatever style of naming you want to use. So in this particular case, since it is a Morpheus plugin and I do work for Morpheus Data, I'm going to utilize com.morpheusdata as the group name. We'll see how that actually applies from a folder structure in just a second. Version 00.1, semantic versioning. So that in this case, the very first version that I'm releasing. A number of the other things are more static, more just general Gradle concepts that I won't delve into. But I do want to touch on dependencies, in particular the Morpheus Plug-In Api. So as we mentioned, the Morpheus Plug-In API library is what helps facilitate the interaction from a Morpheus platform standpoint with the plugin architecture. And so there are a number of versions of the plugins that are released. And so place where we can find that. So I'll jump back to GitHub. So as I mentioned, in this particular case, Go Morpheus, Morpheus-plugin-core is where it is at. So typically what I'll come to is tags. to see the given versions that are available. And so what happens is these get pushed to Maven, central repository, which is where they get pulled down from. So I've just, for ease of use, I just follow the links from developer.morpheusdata.com, come to the repo, and then see what tags are available. The versions or release tags do map to particular Morpheus platform versions. So there are scenarios where a given release of the plugin API, a feature that is released or added in a certain version is not available in previous versions of the platform. So that's certainly one thing to be aware of, which version maps to which version from a platform perspective. So we'll continue on. These are standard ones that are included with the typical build.gradle plugin definitions. So Groovy, RX Java for some of the capabilities, and SLF4J for logging capabilities. One of the main things to note is the plugin class. So in this particular case, I have the group, which we saw was com.morpheusdata.com. So that aligns with our group. In this particular case, the same namespace is used for the plugin. And so if I were to use for a different organization, it might be, as an example, com.contoso. And then I would make that same reference up here as part of my group name. So group name typically changed, as well as the plugin class or the group name component in your plugin class. And then the general name of the plugin. So in this particular case, I'm just calling it tech brief. And then finally, the actual plugin class. And so by plugin class, that means we'll see when we delve into actual creation of the plugin class, we'll see that component. So in this particular case, I've got com.morpheusdata.techbrief.report plugin. And then the plugin version is being pulled from our version. And so now we've got our build.gradle file. So next step is creation of the plugin class. But in order to do that, we need to create the plugin directory structure. So we've got our build.gradle. So what we want to do is create a new folder. These items are covered in the plugin docs at a pretty good level of depth. And so if we take a quick look at the plugin docs, so plugin docs, we see that the general structure is laid out. It's a pretty good detail. And so, but that's literally what we're going to do is we're going to start creating most of that general structure. And so what we want to do is we want to create source or SRC, main. So these are going to be the same for any projects, Groovy. And then where we're going to start to diverge a little bit is com. In this particular case, it's that reverse DNS syntax that we utilize for our group. And then in this case, Morpheus data. So that aligns with whatever you specified as group. So if it would have been Contoso, com.contoso instead of com.morpheusdata, this folder would be named Contoso. So under that folder, we also want to create a tech brief, which is what we saw in our plugin class, tech brief. And then finally, what we're going to do is now be able to create our plugin class. So in this particular case, we're going to name it report plugin.groovy. Is what we want to name it. And so now we're able to reference that plugin class from the actual plugin itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick look. So if you come down here, we've got reports plugin in examples, some content there. The other thing, as I mentioned, is samples. There are a number of samples included in the Git repository that can be utilized for reference. So if I came here, I could see Groovy reports. I can see reports plugin.groovy. And I see a number of capabilities and references from a plugin standpoint. So what I'll do is I will pull this, and then I'll also reference some other information to augment or extend that. So one of the things of note is steadily being aware of our classes and our references across the files. So package name, once again, we're seeing the group that we defined in our build.gradle. In this particular case, we want to change the reports to tech brief, because that's what we named it when we defined our plugin class. The imports, we actually want to import more number of the Morpheus objects. So that's what we actually want to do still. So I'll delete that. Class maps to our reports plugin. The thing is, we want to be very mindful of class naming. So when we defined plugin class, we said report plugin, not reports plugin. So we need to change that from reports plugin to report plugin. Code defines Morpheus metadata about the particular plugin. So let's go tech brief as our code. Initialize, we're defining the actual provider in this particular case, as well as some additional metadata about the plugin. So we want to define the provider for the our plugin. So what we want to do is we want to specify a provider name, which I've already defined some of it. So I'll grab that from another file. In this particular case, we've got AWS volume report provider. AWS volume report provider equals new AWS volume report provider. And so in this particular case, we're defining the provider. As I mentioned, in this scenario, it's custom report that we want to define. And then finally, I'll grab another line. So similar to our actual reference point of adding the provider to the plugin, we define the this.plugin providers.put, and then information about the plugin provider. So we'll pop that in. So if we expand this, drop this down, we can see more of the actual syntax and what it looks like. So I'm instantiating the provider and then finally adding the provider to the plugin. So that's what these two lines are, is what I did. And then we've got name for our particular plugin that I'll grab from a separate file. And then as well as description. So one of the other things to mention is as I mentioned, the API for the plugin architecture does include this information in terms of what can be put here. So what can I define? I can define things like issue URL and some various other aspects of the general plugin capability. So that's what I could do here. And then finally, one of the things that isn't here that I want to add is permissions. So role-based access control within the Morpheus platform enables us to define permissions around what reports, who can access what reports. So in this particular case, I do want to add permissions for this particular plugin. But what I want to do is, since that wasn't previously defined, what I do need to do is add or import the permission. And so in the plugin API docs does include references to certain classes that I may need to import to add certain functionality within the platform capability. And then finally, one thing that I'll do is I'll do it here, and then we'll delve into it a little bit later, is the option type. So, excuse me, we didn't want to see our drop down. So I will add the drop down, so also known as a option source, to our particular plugin. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to see that all unattached or attached capability from a platform perspective. So now that we've got our plugin class all ready to go, what we need next is we'll do next our handlebars template. So what we want our particular plugin to look like, that's what we want to see. So in the case of our templates, they go under source main. Let me see the file structure. So also included in the plugin docs is the information for this. So resources under source main, resources, renderer, HBS, and then finally we got our file. So in this particular case, AWS volume report .hbs. The name could be anything. I typically just align the name of the files to the name of the provider. So what I'll do is I'll grab this particular example. So we can see very basic set of HTML. We do see something that's not native HTML. So this is the Handlebars Templating, very similar to, in some ways, for those that are familiar with Python's Jinja, in terms of the curly braces. So it looks a little bit familiar to that, but at its core, hopefully very straightforward to understand what's going on here. Our headers, ID, name, status, type, size, and then the actual body or the data. We are creating our rows by iterating over data. So the data is coming into the template as main, and then we're iterating through main and accessing the actual data sets under there at data map dot whatever the actual variable that we push that data into as we were defining our tables. So let's keep it moving. So what we want to do now is we want to define our custom report provider class. So our custom provider report class, it's a bit of a mouthful, should reside next to where our report plugin.groovy file lies as well. So AWS volume report provider.groovy. And I'll pull this code set in the interest of time, and we'll delve into some of the aspects that are particularly relevant. There's a number of imports, but package, as we see, same syntax, same format, com.morpheus data, which maps to the group name, and then finally tech brief is what we want to define. A number of these are necessary imports. Some of these you can go through and see what may or may not align. So like an example I can see right off the bat, I'm not actually using date or time. It was pulled from a previous reference, so I can actually pull those out. But as we'll go through, we'll see some of the aspects of the plugin. So the class, we can see that we've got our class name, which maps very same to our file name. It extends our abstract report provider, a couple of references to pull in information about the plugin, as well as some of the Morpheus context. These are pretty standard for all plugins. We see that the reference here maps to the reference here of our class. Pull that in, get Morpheus, which we saw pulling in the context for Morpheus to be able to access some things from the Morpheus standpoint, get the plugin, get a code for our particular provider, get a name. So pretty straightforward in terms of those constructs. Validate various options. That could be just standard. Then finally, as we start to go through, we start to see some of the capability. Let me pull out some of the comments for visibility. We see render template. So what that means is pass me the data. We see that report result, pass the data, some additional information, things like the report rows by section. And then what it's going to do is it's going to take our file, our template, which is what we saw, which is the HBS. So HBS / and then the file name for our template without the extension. And so once we define the path structure, so I could put additional files here. So if I were to want to add another report or a reference to another template, given some logic, I would do the similar scenario where I would utilize the get renderer, render the template, but I would specify the different name of the file. Model is passing the data set. So model.object contains our data set that we're passing to the rendering of the template. And then finally, as part of the rendering process, pass the model. So that's what's happening there. Content security policy. One of the things I could do, as I mentioned, we talked about defining custom CSS, JavaScript, potentially some more exotic things. So if there is information or data or configuration, I'll say, so as an example, if I wanted to use some custom JavaScript that was potentially hosted somewhere or wherever it might be, I would be able to leverage this to allow the browser to be able to access those particular resources because they are non-native. So I could utilize that. But since I'm not actually referencing any external capabilities, I'll just define the security policy as empty and then return that. So here's where we start to get into the meat of what we want to do. So our report has the process, so report process, and then we want to start doing things like the updating of the status. So generating, so for those that generate reports, you see a quick generating status depending upon the size of the report when you start generating the report in Morpheus. So that's what it's doing, is passing back that status. Things like display order, results. In particular, we want to get some of the key information. So things like DB connection is one of the things that we want. Attachment status is our option type, is one of the things that we want to specify. So what we're going to do is instantiate a database connection. We're going to, in this case, we're going to evaluate the attachment status. I can actually pull this out and just go to the single reference point, because the attachment status is always going to be there. So what I'll do is pull that out. So we have our SQL statement that we looked at earlier, and then we specified like as attachment status. So what it's going to do is pass the variable into the SQL statement as either all, which maps to the SQL wildcard effectively, attached or unattached. So as it pulls back that process, and finally close the database connection. Number of things going on here. So logging the results. Then we have an observable from a Java or Groovy standpoint. So essentially all that's going to do is iterate through each of the rows that is returned from the SQL query. So we saw our table, and what it's going to do is it's going to iterate through each of those rows in the table and provide us access to the rows. So that's what we're seeing here. So some logging information by default. So one of the things that I do want to do is we saw that on our max table size, or our max storage row, it was pulling it back in bytes. What I want to do is I want to just convert that to gigabytes. So I'm just doing some very rudimentary math here. Taking the result row, so where we're getting result row from is here. So the name specified here is what each item name is going to be. And then after that point, I can then utilize dot notation and then specify the column name for the particular row. And so in this particular case, we saw that our column name was max_storage. And so I'm setting that to a variable that is size GB. Standard string here. So data, or standard syntax here, that's pretty common in the examples of the reports. What I want to do is I want to aggregate that data. I want to pull back the data I want for each item in our iteration. And so similar to what we saw from our table, we're going to map that akin to this. So name is going to map to the name column in our table. ID, similar story. So send that ID. Status is going to map to the status. So one of the things we saw in our table and in our HTML is that was a little different. Type, I'm using type instead of type ID. This one could technically be type ID and I could pass it through, but we'll take a look at that in a minute. And then finally size, I'm pulling back the variable we just defined and then adding an additional space as well as GB to denote gigabytes. So that's data. So I'm iterating through the record, assigning or putting all of the information into a map. And then what I'm doing is I'm passing the map to the Morpheus construct. So new report result row, section, there by default, display order, but we see is data map. So I'm passing the data that I gathered by iterating over each of the rows into the data map. And so what it's finally doing is it's doing some appending of the rows. So essentially iterate through the table, collect the data, and then finally assign it to a payload for our report. So finally, we got some additional data. There's some additional constructs here that we see in terms of do on error, and then finally subscribe and do on complete. So it's be like do on complete, sets the status in Morpheus to ready, or if there was an error, it sets it to fail. That's where we see the status in our report generation in the UI. Number of final items we'll get to, get description, get category. Category defines the category in Morpheus UI that we assign it to. So in this particular case, I'm putting it in inventory, a number of different settings that we could define. And then finally get option types. So we wanted to specify that drop down as we generate our report for the data set. So one of the things that's particularly important is things like our option type which we want to be to select when we the drop down. Option source, so that's going to map to our attachment status options. So what we're going to do is we're going to really quickly create in the same file structure, excuse me, our option source. So AWS volume report option source provider.groovy. All right, and I'm going to pull in this data set really quick, and then we're going to see what it looks like. So very similar to a number of the other classes we've defined. A lot of the top sections class name maps to that. Getting the Morpheus, getting the plugin, so on and so forth. Get the code, get the name. So the number of pieces are going to map and align up from what we see. So in this particular case, we've got our list. So I want to present the user with all attached, unattached. From a value standpoint that gets passed to our SQL statement that we saw the like, I want the percent symbol attached or unattached, which is what maps to the actual values in our status column for the table. So I'm going to save that. We're going to see the reference point over here. So if I go to, where is it at? Option source, attachment status options. So that's particularly important because that lets us know what to grab. So the method or the capability name is attachment status options. So that's what it's going to pull to reference to pull back that data from the plugin standpoint. All right, so let's take a look. So we've added our plugin class, added our handlebars template, added our custom report provider, option source provider. So now the thing left to do is compile our custom report plugin. So I'm going to open a terminal. I can get to the terminal, new terminal. And I'm going to do Gradle shadow jar. So SHADOW, capital JAR. So let's see if it works. So what it's going to do is pull down the dependencies and start building our actual jar file. All right, take a few seconds the first time, certainly longer than the subsequent builds. We'll see if we did everything correctly. All right, so if we take a look at our file structure, we see build, libs, and we see Morpheus-TB -plugin, and the version number and .jar. All right, so now we've got our jar file. Now let's go and try to actually run a report. So I'm going to come to my Morpheus instance and log in. And come to administration, integrations, plugins. I've got a number of plugins that I've been tinkering on, but we'll add our plugin. So what I want to do is I want to come to, let's see, Morpheus-TB plugin, builds, libs, and then the jar file we just built today, in my case, local time. And then we'll click upload. So if we see if we did everything correctly, and now we got the check that it's enabled. Everything looks good. We're not getting invalid. So let's try and generate our report. So operations reports, going to filter the category inventory. So now we've got AWS volume report. So tech brief sample report is what our description was. Let's click run now. Attachment status is what we're presented with. We saw that that was option source. We've got all attached and unattached. So the moment of truth, here it comes. So we're going to click run. We're going to just leave it as all and click run. So now what we have is our status was generated in terms of now it's ready. So that's what we talked about when we the status updates. So whether it was ready, generating, or failed. So finally, we're going to click on the report. So now that we see our report is generated, it provides a status information into the status of our EBS volumes. We see that 1 is attached, 3 are unattached. Really quickly, let's try see if the filter actually works. Inventory, and then we'll select run now. And attachment status, let's just see the unattached. I want to clean up my EBS volumes. I just want to see the unattached EBS volumes. So now we see just only the unattached volumes for our particular environment. So in this particular case, it's pulling back all the volumes in this particular environment, which in this scenario includes 2 AWS clouds, one in US East 1, one in US West 2. So it's pulling back volumes from both of those regions, would pull back the volume information across various regions that have been configured within a particular instance. In my scenario, I only have 2 AWS clouds configured. All right, so now we've walked through the end-to-end process of development of a plugin. So we installed the plugin, we generated a report utilizing the custom plugin. Certainly a lot of more nuance and a number of additional details that could be expanded upon. Certainly we could delve into more of the visual aspects of the plugin, start to look at charts and graphs, but hopefully this has provided a basic introduction in terms of development of a plugin. So a number of resources that are available for custom report plugins. As I mentioned, some of the references we looked at in developer.morpheusdata.com for reports plugins. There is a getting started guide in the docs that you can search for custom reports, and it'll pull back that information. And then finally, in the GitHub repository that we looked at in reference, we saw that there was a sample custom report that we could take a look at and build and develop on. All right, so as we get to the end of this tech brief, certainly a number of other ways to experience Morpheus for those that are new to Morpheus or just want some more hands-on. There is a Morpheus Community Edition that is free to download and use. You can go to morpheushub.com, sign up, and then download the Community Edition, which provides support for up to 3 clouds as well as 25 workloads. Certainly a great place to get started with plugin development, or for those that are in organizations that have production environments, certainly a great place to tinker in and test some plugin things with. In addition to that, you can utilize our website if you want a demonstration of additional Morpheus capabilities from one of our SEs. Certainly feel free to schedule a demo. One of the things we got a question. So as a beginner, starting with custom report plugins, what references we can look for? So one of the things to reference, so typically reference into in this particular example, our build.gradle file. Let's take a look at our build.gradle file. So typically the only things that I ever change from the build.gradle file standpoint, so oftentimes I typically just reference the samples. I copy the sample build.gradle file and I'll modify the things that need to be modified. So typically, as I mentioned, only things I modify typically are group and version. And then finally, any dependencies. So typically I will bump or increment the plugin API version for Morpheus that I may have a specific reason for or a specific use case for. One of the examples is in a more recent version, excuse me, of Morpheus, plugin settings were made available. And so what plugin settings are is a way to specify certain settings for the plugin that can be configured dynamically or on the fly by the administrator. As an example, being able to provide credentials for the plugin to leverage or just configuration data on whether to, as an example, show or hide a UI component. In addition to that, I may come in and add additional libraries to the actual dependencies. So whether it's something like an AWS SDK or a Slack SDK, whatever it might be. And then finally, the section related to plugin class to specify the naming structure for my particular plugin. Great question. So as we get ready to wrap up, one of the things to note is certainly the plugins provide great capability in terms of the structure and the functionality of the plugin. One of the other things I do want to call out and mention is very recently, Morpheus has a discussion forum. So discuss.morpheusdata.com is a really good place to find some additional information and community interaction for things like plugin development. One of the things we see is there is a category for plugins. So if there are additional questions about plugins, this is a great place to come and ask questions. For those existing Morpheus customers, there is an option to log on utilizing an existing account that you may have. So certainly feel free to come to discuss.morpheusdata.com to get any additional information about plugins. All right, so let's wrap up. So I certainly appreciate the time. We are certainly well over what was the desired duration of time, but I appreciate everyone hanging on. And certainly, as I mentioned, feel free to go to discuss.morpheusdata.com if there are any additional questions that we can provide assistance or help with. So thank you.